Welcome to another night in the archive. Tonight, we will be going through my collection of tales and narrative poetry. The Stag of Glass Harbor. They called the port Glass Harbor because it never showed the same face twice. The water was a smoked mirror returning not the sky but the underside of clouds, bruised lilac and liver. Nets came up heavy with eels and rumor. Every tide curled up the rotting steps of the quay, as if trying to climb into a house and claim a bed. Mara, the miller's daughter, though the mill had not turned for years, belonged to no one. She wore her father's knife in her boot, and his dead like a second shadow. In a city that preferred its women like the dolls in the apothecary window, no joints to bend, glass skin and corked silence, Mara had knees, opinions, and hands that could break bread or a nose with equal competence. At dusk, she wheeled sacks of stale flour to bakers who stretched loaves with lies. At dawn, she rode out among the men and threw her net into the bruised mirror until her shoulders burned. When the fishermen spat and called her bad luck, she spat back and said, "Luck was a dog that came when called by the one with the meat." It was not courage, it was appetite. She hungered for a room that locked from the inside, a window that faced something other than the alley's eye. She hungered for a law that would bend to the weight of her wanting. Into this harbor, on an All Souls' Eve when the moon was an oyster refusing to open, returned the stag. Children had a dozen nursery names for him. Widows kept another, the husband of the leftover. He was not man and not beast, but the theorem that proved both. Witnesses spoke of river weed and wedding veils, and a rack of bone-bearing candles that burned with foxfire. In his wake, bargains beached, rings without fingers, shoes with damp roses, quiet doors ajar. It was said the stag chose wives for a year and a day, gave them exactly what they asked for, and charged them the price of what they had forgotten to ask. On the morning after the stag's return, Mara found her father at the silent millstone with a bottle and a bruise. Two men with cuffs like cuffs of foam had visited. They owned the debt that owned the mill that owned his bones. Numbers bored them. Flesh would entertain. First frost, they'd said, and the daughter as payment. He expected weeping, a daughter's smallness. What he received was arithmetic. Mara counted knives, exits, and the river's slow breath. "Keep your nerves," she told him. "I will belong to no man who keeps books. I will belong to something with antlers." That night, she went to the harbor with bread in her pockets and fire in her throat. Fog webbed the masts. The moon's pearl lay shut. The stag came walking down the pier as if the darkness had rehearsed him, and finally remembered his lines. He smelled of salt and a bridal veil kept too long in a box. Candlelight clung to him like bees. Where his cloven feet came down, muscles opened and shut as if embarrassed. Mara spat her torch into flame. "I need a dowry," she said, "and a year in which no man touches me without a glove of my choosing. I need a roof that cannot be entered by the door. What do you ask in exchange, my lord of carrion and courtship?" In the skull sockets, foxfire made eyes that did not blink. His voice was the softest part of an animal, the belly where the fur thins. "Only that you ask precisely," said the stag, "and that you eat what is set before you." "Then I ask for sanctuary," said Mara, "and I will not eat lies." "Sanctuary has two walls," the stag said. "One keeps out, the other keeps in. Come." The girl with the avalanche key. In 1986, the mountain wore its snow like a wedding dress no one dared to take off. The town below, Garnet, a seam of neon and gravel pressed between ribs of pine, lived by the mines that had already left. Men sharpened their boots on memory. Women stitched new hems into old coats and blew on their hands as if warmth were a coin you could make interest on. The jukebox at the Elk and Antler coughed out power ballads that promised a heaven built of eyeliner and smoke machines. The mountains said nothing. Mountains are old women. Their best words are withheld until somebody deserves them. Our heroine, call her Rhea Vale, grew up in a shotgun house with 3 locks on the door and none on conversation. She tuned carburetors by ear and threaded needles in a wind that cut the town into obedient slices. People said Rhea had a wolf's patience and an angel's wrists. They said it like an accusation. By day, she pumped gas at her uncle's station and kept a baseball bat under the counter for men who thought girls were vending machines for smiles. By night, she repaired radios and recorded her own voice onto cassettes because the town's small FM station only liked girls if their voices wore aprons. Garnet had a winter monarch, as every mountain town secretly does. His name was Mr. Crowder, though the old women called him the groom, and he lived in the abandoned Crown Hotel perched like a frozen cake near the summit. He had inherited money from somebody else's quietus and invested it in weather. He could whistle a squall out of its sulk. He could order ice to lace the river like a prom dress. The hotel had a ballroom with chandeliers that refused to admit electricity was a modern invention, and a pool whose surface remembered every face that had leaned over it and made a wish it did not intend to finance. Rhea was not interested in crowns or grooms. She wanted a car that could take a corner at 70 without confessing, a room of her own above the station, and a mother who would stop treating silence as a sacrament. But Garnet had its own appetite. The winter, Mr. Crowder set his eye on Rhea's mother, April Vale, once golden, now brittle as a hymn sung too often. Rhea understood that appetite would not leave if you turned your head. April began receiving gifts, roses that kept their frost like jewelry, a pair of ice skates that cut the air even when still, a letter written on paper so thin the words seeped through and tattooed the table. "Come up the mountain," it said, in a hand that had learned obedience from snow. "I keep a warm house." "You'll not answer," Rhea said, putting the letter near the stove and letting it warm to confession. "He collects." "He collects weddings," April said with a tremor of vanity you could almost forgive. "No one stays married to a winner." "Some don't stay themselves," Rhea answered. Mr. Crowder invited everyone to the Crown for a charity ball to fund the skating rink that would clean the town's conscience. Rhea wore a dress she had cut from a torn prom gown, black as an oil spill, silvered with sequins scavenged like fish scales. She went to escort her mother, but also to hunt. In her boot, she carried a flat wrench ground to a blade and wrapped in red thread. In her mouth, she carried a story. The Crown Hotel felt like a mouth that had just eaten and was pretending not to. The carpet was burgundy, the mirrors full of ghosts with good posture. In the ballroom, a band with hair like bad weather played covers while men in leased tuxedos tried on manners they would not afford by morning. Mr. Crowder descended the grand staircase, wearing a suit the color of a raven's idea of snow. He had a smile like a razor tucked into a prayer book. When he kissed April's hand, frost bloomed under her skin and traveled toward her elbow as if looking for a ring. Rhea watched him the way a mechanic watches a car that has learned to lie. He moved like a weather report, inevitable, justified. When he looked at her, the chandelier light bent as if to flatter him further. He asked her to dance. Rhea said yes, because a refusal is more expensive than a touch when you're poor and female. His palm was colder than a truth told too late. He smelled like mint under a floorboard. "You are a story that has not been finished," he said. "I am good at endings." "I prefer to do my own editing," she said, and let him steer her through a waltz crooked as a county line. At midnight, he made an announcement. He would host a winter court at the Crown until the thaw. The chosen those whose letters had gone unanswered, whose wages had been docked by invisible teeth, whose throats knew the name of hunger, might enter his employ. There would be rooms and food and fur coats, heavy as promises. There would be music that remembered your body better than you did. April Vale accepted before anyone else. Rhea stood very still and felt the mountain's attention tip like a pitcher. The first night at the Crown, they gave the women white nightgowns that turned anyone into a cautionary tale and fed them sugared snow in crystal bowls. Rhea didn't sleep. She waited until the staff had finished polishing their smiles and climbed the service stairs into the hotel's throat. The wallpaper peeled like an old scandal. Behind the laundry room, a locked door inhaled. Rhea leaned against it and felt it breathe winter on her neck. The keyhole tasted metallic on her tongue. She spoke through the keyhole the way a thief speaks to a diary, open for the girl who refuses to be kept. The blade in her boot slid into the lock and turned with the sound of a violin deciding to be a saw. The door opened on a room colder than consequence, lit by jars glowing with their own pale religion. Each jar held one winter. They were labeled in careful hand: January 58, Christmas 64, the year the river froze right to the bed, the night the coyotes sang three-part harmony. On a shelf, a row of anklet keys hung on blue ribbons, each shaped like a house key, each engraved with a girl's initial. The floor glittered with shaved ice and something like mica. When Rhea touched it, it tasted like last chances. Rhea understood. Mr. Crowder collected winters the way a jealous man collects alibis. He served them in courses to women who mistook hunger for romance. He locked his brides to his house, one anklet, one key, and when spring came, he returned them to town, hollowed out like Easter eggs, with only a sugared air inside. You could live full on that air for a time, and then you would realize you were light enough to be blown over by the promise of a song, the threat of a fist, the rumor of a miracle. Rhea chose a jar labeled "The Avalanche That Didn't" and tucked it under her dress, where it was warm and not. She took 3 keys: A for April, R for Rhea, and J for whoever would need it next. Then she closed the door, rethreaded the lock with a hair from her own head, and went back to bed with the jar against her sternum. It beat like a second heart. Morning brought lessons in obedience disguised as hospitality. A woman named Miss Keene taught them how to set a table so the knives looked friendly. A man with a pelt on his back instead of a coat taught them how to skate without leaving a mark. Mr. Crowder taught them how to listen to a word so hard it confessed another word hiding inside it. Rhea excelled the way predators excel at camouflage. She became an echo you could put on a leash. At dusk, he led April to the hotel pool and said something about the purity of ice that never had to drown anything the way a river does. Rhea followed at a distance, jaw warm against her ribs. She watched her mother make the mistake of equating stillness with safety. Mr. Crowder produced an anklet key in the shape of an A and reached for her ankle, the way a salesman reaches for your hand with a contract in it. Rhea stepped forward and let the jar slip from under her dress, where it shattered on the tile with the precise sound of a glass slipper telling the truth. The room inhaled. The winter labeled, the avalanche that didn't stood up from its own remains and remembered it had been interrupted. Snow fell from nowhere with the noise of skin, going to goose flesh. The pool cracked like a shout. Mr. Crowder's face developed a network of delicate crimes. Rhea took her mother's ankle while everyone looked up at the ceiling to decide whether it was falling and slipped the stolen key onto April. "Run," she said, and April, who had learned obedience as a dialect, hesitated a fraction. That fraction melted. The anklet dropped like a bad habit. April ran. Mr. Crowder turned toward Rhea with a smile he might have used during his own christening. "You've broken a winter," he said. "That has consequences. You may wear them as jewels or shackles. I offer both." "I prefer a tool," she said, and drew from her pocket not the blade but a cassette tape labeled Side B, Storm. She had recorded the mountain's hum onto it by sleeping with the recorder under her pillow. Now she pushed the tape into the hotel's sound system, which governed the ballroom, where the town was eating soup that tasted like a submissive idea. The speakers coughed, and then the mountain's lullaby entered the veins of the crown. It was a frequency older than rent. The chandeliers stopped pretending to be constellations and started being light. The jar room rattled like a drawer of teeth deciding to bite. Mr. Crowder lunged for the console. Rhea met him halfway and learned what a weatherman's bones feel like under your hands. Brittle weather, stored. He was not strong. He was the illusion of strength, which is to say he was a habit. Habits are hard to kill, better to retrain them. Rhea kissed him, quick, cruel, transactional, as if making a blood pact with winter, and while his mouth was busy trying to requisition her breath, she whispered into it, "Work for me instead." Men have died of that sentence. Mr. Crowder did not. He froze, then he thawed. He considered the options with the carefulness of a man counting chips at a table whose owner has just changed. "Terms?" he asked, because contracts are the way cowards pray. Rhea named them. The winter would serve the women of Garnet first. The anklets would be unfastened, and their keys melted into sewing needles and car keys and bottle openers. The ballroom would be used for skate practice until legs learned to love their own weight more than any waltz. And the jars would be uncorked to make a weather that answered to the town and not to a groom. In exchange, she would leave him with a legend that kept him comfortable, but not sovereign. Legends are another way of making the rich behave. He smiled like a chapel thief asked to design the stained glass. "Done," he said, and his breath made lace in the air that didn't melt for a long time. The mountain ratified the agreement, with a noise like a deer's hoof snapping a twig to remind the forest who has knees. They set about it immediately. Rhea led April down to the room of winters and opened each jar with the bold reverence you keep for undressing your own future. January 58 came out whistling. Christmas 64 smelled of orange peel and backseat forgiveness. The night the coyotes sang. Three-part harmony arrived with a harmony that made three women decide to growl when their men lied. The keys on the ribbons trembled like small birds ready to migrate. Rhea and the others cut them down and fed them to the hotel's furnace, which learned, for the first time, to burn for women. The town below woke to unfamiliar competence. Icicles formed railings for old men to climb their own porches. Teenage girls learned to drive in parking lots, where the snow arranged itself into cones. At the station, Rhea installed a heater that didn't groan and put a cot in the back room for women who needed a night between doors. She wore her own melted key as a lip ring, a small gleam that turned anyone's sermon to steam. Mr. Crowder kept his end. He hosted thaw dances where the punch was laced with spite and vitamin C. He kissed hands and signed checks and learned to live with the knowledge that he no longer owned winter. He leased it from a girl with oil under her nails. Sometimes at night, he prowled the hotel and held conversazioni with the chandeliers, reminiscing about sovereignty. They patronized him politely. Old light prefers new skin. Not everyone approved. The sheriff declared the anklet forging a property crime until his wife threaded a length of melted key through his collar and reintroduced him to manners. A preacher whose breath smelled like apology tried to start a crusade against the girl at the gas station. He discovered his flock preferred the miracle of plowed streets. A few men looked up at the crown and felt a nostalgia for tyranny. They drove their trucks up the switchbacks to see whether the old door would open for them. The mountain rolled an avalanche in its mouth like a marble and declined to swallow. Spring arrived 2 weeks early and stayed to gossip. April Vale, freed from her ice bracelets, began to blush like a girl learning a new alphabet. She took a job at the rink teaching beginners how to fall well. Falling well is an adult subject. She laughed sometimes. The laugh had edges, but you can cook on edges if you learn how to stir. She planted a row of pansies behind the station and wrote letters to no one, which is a good practice if you have never owned your own voice. On the last night of the season, Rhea went alone to the ballroom. The mountain's cassette had snapped. She had spliced it with red thread and a prayer spoken entirely in swears. Mr. Crowder was waiting in the doorway, looking like a man on the verge of learning to apologize without rehearsal. He offered his hand. "No keys," he said, and she saw that he meant it as a vow and as a plea. She danced with him because she had changed the conditions. The mirrors watched without judgment. The chandeliers held their breath the way old ladies do at a christening. "You thought you could keep us," she said low into his ear. "You can't keep weather, only borrow it. You can't keep women, only lose them more slowly if you are lucky." "I learned," he said, and she believed him the way you believe a wolf not to run when it hears its name, cautiously, admiring the courtesy of the effort. Rhea left the Crown with a toolbox full of needles, a ledger of Faber's Ode, and the avalanche beating where her heart had split to make room. She bought the station from her uncle. She turned the car wash into a workshop where girls brought broken appliances and left with machines and the skill to defy them when necessary. She hosted a midnight radio show that rode the spine of the interstate like a rumor with headlights. She played songs that made men cry in their trucks and taught women how to fix their own ignitions. And when winter came again, and it did, pleased to be invited, Rhea stood at the base of the pass and raised the new snowplow tooth like a queen lifts a sword named for what it kills. She had the avalanche with her. It was a trained dog now, large and loyal, prone to knocking down bad fences so the deer could test the hydrangeas. Mr. Crowder sent down a crate of oranges and a letter that admitted envy without expecting absolution. April Vale knitted a scarf whose pattern read, in code, "No more house keys." Fairytales always ask for a wedding, but Garnet held a thaw. People pinned their old anklets to telephone poles the way you hang ribbons for a soldier who has deserted the wrong war. The rink turned into a dance floor slick as a new idea. Rhea wore a dress made of seatbelts stitched with silver thread and kissed a girl from the library in front of everyone who had ever thought they owned the weather. The kiss tasted like gears and oranges and the first honest sweat of May. Mr. Crowder clapped from the edge and did not ask for anything in return. That was his penance. That was his education. If you visit now, the Crown has been converted into a public lodge. The jar room is gone. In its place, a workshop where boys learn to sew and girls learn to break chains on purpose, and everyone learns to sharpen skates without ruining the edge with vanity. On the summit, someone hung a sign that reads, "Avalanche Training, Advanced," and below it a smaller sign that reads, "For Fences Only." The mountain remains an old woman and listens, as if listening were a profession that finally pays. The men who miss the old winters still meet at the Elk and Antler to complain that the snow is not like it once was, that women have made it political. The jukebox plays a power ballad whose chorus goes, "I am not your season." Rhea keeps the bat behind the counter, out of sight, because the mountain taught her a better weapon, weather that minds women. She is not a bride. She is the girl who picks the locks of January and sells the metal as needles. She is the one who taught winter how to behave. And if on some nights Garnet wakes to find the road cleared to the clinic before dawn, or hears the mountain humming in the crown speakers, or sees, just once, a thin white bracelet dissolve on a woman's ankle as if it had never been there, well, the town nods. Some legends are true the way wrenches are because they fit. The avalanche sleeps at the station under the workbench. When a storm lies or a man does, Rhea whistles, and it remembers not to fall on the wrong roofs. The year the river answered. They say the Caimán River never learned to flow in one direction. In summer, it went east like any respectable river, and in winter it crawled back up its own bed, as if ashamed of what it had carried to the sea. The town of San Gregorio adjusted its chairs accordingly. Fishermen tied their boats facing both ways. Children learned to swim without asking where the current would be tomorrow. And the postmistress, who was a widow named Alma Beltran, kept 2 ledgers for letters, one for those leaving the town and another for those that would return without being sent back. Alma had been appointed during the time when the church bells rang by themselves, and the mayor developed a tendency to float off his chair during council meetings if nobody had the presence of mind to hold his ankles. She came with a square jaw and a habit of ironing her blouses on the same board where she read the telegrams. Most mornings, while the bakery cooled on its own size, she sat by the window and sorted the envelopes by weight, because in San Gregorio, the weight of a letter said more than its stamp. A heavy letter meant someone had written the truth. By the middle of her first year, the townspeople had grown used to addressing their letters to the dead. It started with the cobbler, who wrote to his father asking whether he should whip the leather with vinegar or holy water. He received no reply, but the boots that year softened in the rain and remembered their owner's feet better than their owners did. After the cobbler came the teacher, who composed a long letter to the woman he would have married if she had not married someone else during a flood. He handed the envelope to Alma without so much as a stamp, and Alma, who did not believe in misplacing affections, placed it in the second ledger. Soon everyone was sending letters to the dead. Recipes for the foods the living could no longer afford, inventories of apologies, drawings of houses that had never been built because the walls kept walking away during the night. Alma registered them all. She placed them in burlap sacks with the seriousness of a midwife and took them to the river whenever it was going east, because the sea had a reputation for knowing what to do with sorrow. On those days, she said aloud the names on the envelopes one by one, a procession of grandmothers and first loves and stillborn sons. And the river accepted the sacks with the courtesy of a stranger who has seen one too many wakes. Nothing remarkable happened until the third year, when the governor sent a man with a hat, like a new roof, to count the living. He arrived with 3 assistants and a scale that could weigh the hope of a town if you piled it correctly. The census was taken on the plaza under the Ceiba that had been struck by lightning exactly once and had afterward taken the habit of blooming in November. The census taker wrote down the names and ages and the peculiarities that San Gregorio had confused with virtues, who cried during thunderstorms, who could grow mangoes in their pockets, who was still paying a debt incurred before he was born. At the end of the week, the man with the hat asked for the number of the dead, and the town, having never counted them, looked to Alma. "You have their addresses," he said. "I have their names," she said. And since San Gregorio respected correct nouns more than correct procedures, they made her the keeper of the dead by acclamation. She accepted without celebration, because somebody had to keep the ledgers from growing moss. The following Sunday, the river changed its mind. It decided to go west, which is to say it went backward into the mountains and the rain clouds and the beginnings of stories. At dawn, Alma found the burlap sack she had thrown into the current years before resting against the pilings of the post office, as if they had returned from a long voyage with presents for everyone. The town gathered on the dock in their good shoes, and the schoolchildren posed for photographs that would never develop properly because the camera had remembered to forget. Alma opened the first sack and pulled out an envelope addressed to a man who had been eaten by a jaguar during a carnival. The letter was sealed with an unfamiliar wax. She cracked it with her thumbnail and read that the jaguar had learned to sing and was teaching the man to count in a new language where numbers had the taste of guava. The widow of the man, who had been making empanadas in order to spite grief by feeding others, folded the letter into a square and wore it under her blouse like a relic. She lived another 30 years with a temperate heart. Another envelope bore the name of the teacher's first love. The handwriting inside was neat but translucent, as if written on the other side of water. She wrote that she had moved to a village where the windows always faced the sunrise, no matter how you built the houses, and that in her garden, the mulberry tree had learned to bear photographs. Under the letter were 2 leaves that had become negatives of wedding portraits. The teacher, who had never stopped speaking with chalk on his cuffs, pressed the leaves in a book he never lent to anyone and grew quiet in the manner of men who have been forgiven. By noon, the sacks had yielded 900 letters and a child who had been lost since the hurricane of the previous decade. He crawled out of the last bag sleepy and annoyed, wearing a shirt that had been stitched from scraps of newspaper headlines. His mother, who had kept his room the way one keeps a jar of honey, just in case the bees return, took him home by the ear. On the way, she scolded the river for its lateness, and the river, which did not argue, swelled enough to flood the tiled floor of the mayor's office and baptize the accounts with a tide mark that stayed there forever. From that day forward, the dead wrote back as regularly as rain. Their letters arrived whenever the river traveled toward the headwaters, which was often in San Gregorio. Even the calendar wandered. The letters did not always answer the questions posed. Frequently, they returned recipes with the ingredients out of order, so that the soups became sorbets and the sorrows came out differently. Once, a woman who had asked for money received the scent of her mother's hair combed at twilight, which paid for everything she bought that year. Another time, the town judge, who counted himself a realist because he did not believe in love, wrote to his brother demanding an explanation for a certain inheritance. He received a basket of crickets who sang at night until he remembered a mistake made in July, and the matter was settled. The governor sent an inspector to regulate the correspondence. He installed a lock on Alma's door and decreed that all letters from the dead must be taxed according to their usefulness, which he measured on his scale. But the inspector's wife had the habit of floating out of bed at dawn, and the only way to keep her was to weigh her down with the letters she'd received from her mother during the previous month. The inspector took the lock off Alma's door and declared that spiritual assets could not be taxed without losing the receipts to mildew. It was during that time that Alma began to receive letters addressed to herself. The first was a menu for a wedding feast, written in the calligraphy of a man she had loved before the war. It listed the dishes in an order that could only be eaten if you began with the dessert, and kept backward until you reached the soup. She ate it as instructed, and slept like a cat on warm stones for the first time in years. The second letter contained nothing but a date in a future month, and the suggestion to wear yellow. Alma did not own yellow, which is a color that requires complicity with the sun, but she borrowed a skirt from the school teacher's niece. On the given date, she met a man on the dock whose hands owned the river skillfully. They spoke the number of words required for a good meal. He left with the current, and Alma never saw him again, which is not the same as losing him. She kept the skirt. The world, overhearing all this, grew curious and sent omens. Birds appeared that had forgotten their names and accepted new ones politely. The moon leaned lower on certain Thursdays. Bakers reported that the dough had begun to rise by listening to old stories. The town barber discovered that when he shaved a man whose father had died young, the lather smelled of tobacco and the afternoon's last light. Nobody thought it unusual. In San Gregorio, what could be explained was often suspicious. Not all letters were benevolent. A crate arrived one April containing the toothaches of a family that had lived in the next century. The pain wandered from mouth to mouth among the neighbors for a week and then went on with its migration. The chapel, tired of hearing the same petitions, wrote 3 letters of its own asking for fresher sins, and the priest, who had a sense of humor that improved during storms, delivered them during Sunday Mass. For a month afterward, the confessional smelled of salt and good intention. By then, the town had grown adept at keeping 2 truths in the same drawer. On days when the river moved west, fishermen collected their nets full of news instead of fish and fried the news in oil until it became edible. Their wives served it with limes that had learned to sweeten the future. When the current went east, the bells returned to ringing themselves to announce weddings that did not end, and funerals that began with laughter. Children who were born at flood tide stayed slightly wet all their lives and had to be dried with stories, which the elders obliged them by telling in hammocks. The year the governor died of exhaustion, his heart had been counting the living too fast for years, Alma was elected by unanimous indifference to the city council. She accepted because she kept the longest ledgers, and because nobody else wanted to keep a chair from floating away during meetings. Under her care, the council set to solving the town's intractable problems: the pothole at the end of Calle del Sol, the noise of roosters during funerals, the question of what to do with the bells on days they preferred silence. Alma's solution was to ask the dead. She sent them a municipal questionnaire in 7 sacks. The answers returned with a tide of frogs that jumped directly from childhood to widowhood, without stopping at maturity, which made them suitable for government work. The council adopted their recommendations. Holes were to be left alone so that people would learn to step lightly. Roosters should be invited to weep during funerals so the men would not have to. Bells would be allowed a yearly vacation in August. Because her hands were always full of envelopes, Alma delegated the closing of the post office each night to the youngest apprentice, a boy who lived across the street with an aunt who raised iguanas. One evening, the boy failed to shut the door properly, and the letters escaped. They unfurled themselves like migrating birds and nested in the Saba. The town woke to the sound of murmuring paper. For 2 days, citizens climbed ladders to fetch their correspondence, but some letters resisted and flapped away to the roofs. A certain soldier, newly returned from a war nobody had noticed going on, found his letter under a tile and read that he had been born with the gift of not dying in his own stories. He left at once for other towns, and in each he survived 10 versions of his fate before settling with a woman who wrote notes on his palm to correct the narrative. In San Gregorio, people continued to collect what belonged to them and ignored what did not, which is, after all, the essence of good manners. The most persistent opposition to the letters came from a woman named Isabel Cuervo, who suffered from a cleanliness of the soul that made her intolerant of mysteries. She lobbied the council to outlaw correspondence with the dead. When she failed, she organized a parade of white sheets to cover the river. The cloth floated for an afternoon and then sank, as was to be expected, because water always insists on its own appearance. That night, Isabel found an envelope under her pillow and, against her principles, opened it. Inside, there was nothing but a list of her childhood's favorite fruits. She began to buy papayas again in secret. Within a month, she was writing to the dead more fervently than anyone else. The only one who never wrote was Alma herself, during the 7th year. She had said everything she needed to say, and was learning the special happiness of remaining silent. Wordless days can be an occupation if you do them steadily. She took to walking at dawn along the dock, touching each mooring post as if counting rosary beads for a religion that did not require absolution. It was during one of these walks that she found a bottle rolling along the edge of the river, like a lazy dog. Inside was a letter written in the cramped, stubborn script of her mother, who had been buried with a rosary in a town where rosaries were outlawed, but mothers were not. The letter contained 3 recipes, one for a cure for loneliness made of coffee and the second rain, one for a way to sleep on nights when sleep refused to cooperate, and one for a bread that did not rise so much as it waited, producing a crumb that could withstand a journey. Alma baked the bread and took a loaf to every door on her street without ringing the bells. As the town aged, its legends became less ambitious. People contented themselves with short miracles. A family discovered their house was pregnant and waited 9 months for the new room, which was born during a storm with a window already crying. An old man ate a peach stone by mistake and grew a tree in his lungs that perfumed his breath so exquisitely he was forgiven on principle. A cat that had forgotten how to be distant allowed the children to comb its dreams. The letters continued, dependable as accidents. The end of the matter arrived, the way endings usually do, in San Gregorio, with a rumor. A poleman on the river heard that the sea was leaving. It had become tired of holding the horizon in place and had decided to lie down elsewhere. People looked to the west and saw nothing different. The rumor grew like a vine until it produced its first fruit. The fish stopped remembering how to swim east. The mail sacks brought back only one letter, and it was addressed to the town itself. Alma called a meeting under the ceiba, where the frogs sat in orderly rows like officials. The letter was short. It said, "You have learned to live with the answers. Now learn to live without them." It was signed with a drop of water that stained the wood table into the shape of a sleeping infant. The council debated 3 days without reaching an opinion. On the 4th day, the river refused to choose a direction and stayed still. The town understood that the correspondence was over. People felt the absence the way a limb remembers a childhood bruise. For a time, they continued to bring their questions to the dock and let them go into the calm, as one releases a bird already dead. Children played post office with snakes. Alma put the second ledger in a chest on top of the blankets that had kept her husband warm the year his lungs became windows. She kept the first ledger because the living still needed stamps. The ceiba, which had grown accustomed to receiving the news before anyone else, dropped a rain of small leaves that looked like canceled postage. Alma aged without complaining, the way letters do when they have been opened and reread until they fold along the same creases as their owners' faces. On afternoons when the heat developed the patience of a saint, she sat on the post office steps and told the apprentices how things had been. She did not dramatize. She said that once the river had been useful for more than fish, and that people who read enough become legible themselves. She said that the dead were not better correspondents than the living. They were only less hurried. She taught the apprentices to weigh each envelope in the palm before committing to a price, because sometimes the heaviness had nothing to do with how far it had to travel. When she could no longer climb the stairs to her room over the post office, the townspeople carried her to the house where her mother had baked the first unambitious miracles. Alma slept on a bed that had hosted 2 generations of arguments, and the conclusion to a love story that never felt the need to prove itself. On the night of her last birthday, a breeze entered through the shutters with the politeness of a letter that found its addressee at home. Alma smelled the bread she had baked decades before and knew it was time to cross whatever river waited. She put on the yellow skirt without asking permission of the darkness. In the morning, the apprentices found the ledgers in their places and the scales set to 0. The river had chosen to move east again, taking with it the fog and what remained of the frog's expertise. People came to the post office as usual. The apprentice who had once failed to close the door set about sorting the mail as if nothing extraordinary had happened. In San Gregorio, that is how we recognize miracles, by our ability to continue. The letters stopped coming, but the effects did not. The widow kept wearing the first reply under her blouse until the ink faded into her skin and gave her a new heart line. The teacher's book with the mulberry leaves was lost to mold, but the photographs continued to occur in the garden as a hereditary condition of the soil. The judge retired to raise crickets. Isabel Cuervo died at a respectable age and was buried with a papaya seed in her mouth. 3 months later, a tree sprang from her grave, and those who ate its fruit felt, for a second, an exquisite, almost unbearable cleanliness of the soul that made them forgive someone inconvenient. Every so often, a tourist arrives and asks about the year the dead wrote letters. The town tells them whatever version makes the best use of the moment. We speak calmly, so they will not think we want to be believed. They nod in that way. Outsiders nod when their mouths are deciding whether to smile. They buy a loaf of bread at the bakery that still waits instead of rising and leave carrying the flavor of a second rain. If you ask why nobody saved the letters, we will tell you that paper is a poor material for eternity. The river keeps better archives. In certain summers, when the Cayman remembers to return to its source, you can see the answers spread along the stones like laundry. Sentences flapping, signatures fading, the paragraph that taught Alma to wear yellow. Children splash among them without reverence, and the elders, sitting in their chairs adjusted once again for the change in current, agree that nothing has been lost that was not first given. When I pass the post office now, I hold my own letters a little longer than necessary. The apprentices weigh them with the attention that was Alma's gift to us. They do not ask who I am writing or why I still prefer stamps to electricity. I buy the envelope that fits the size of the truth and seal it with my breath, because saliva is one of the few things that has remembered its purpose. Then I walk to the dock and wait for the river to make up its mind, which we... Someone on the stairs. Autumn, 1947. Tom Harlan had lived alone at the end of Ash Street for almost a year when he decided the house had learned his rhythms. It was the small things a place notices. The way he set his boots side by side on the mat. How he knocked ash from a match with 2 taps against the sink. The exact spot his spoon clicked when he set it down after soup. He liked the regularity. After wartime, regularity felt like a promise. If the day begins this way and ends this way, then the hours in between will behave. He worked at the rail yard, late shift most weeks. The smell of oil never quite left his hands. The radio gave him company when he came home. Baseball scores, weary music, a host who sounded like he was trying to smile without breaking it. Tom ate at the kitchen table, wrote a few lines to his sister in Ohio, rinsed a plate, and went to bed. On Fridays, he swept. On Sundays, he shaved again and took a longer walk. It was the last week of October 1947. Coal smoke drifted over town and a weak cold ran along the river. Children rehearsed for Halloween by knocking on doors at the wrong times and then laughing as they ran. At the Five and Dime, Mrs. Klein sold masks that looked like they would tear if you breathed too hard. She told Tom to leave his porch light on for the children if he was going to be home. "They're skittish of your place," she said, tapping the counter. "Edge of town and all." He told her he would. Tom's house stood where the paved road thinned to gravel. It was plain, a narrow two-story with a bowed porch and clapboard siding that needed paint. He kept the things he needed where he could see them. The skeleton key hung on a nail by the stove. The spare bulbs lived under the sink in a paper bag. The axe leaned in the cellar corner, edge covered in a leather cap. He was not a superstitious man. He did, however, keep his doors locked and his windows latched because that was how you behaved toward weather and strangers. The first odd thing was barely worth notice. One Thursday night, the stairwell bulb burned out 2 weeks ahead of schedule. He said, "All right," to no one, took the step stool and changed it. Glass grit pricked his palm when he unscrewed the dead bulb. He wiped it on his pants and finished the job. When he climbed down, the new bulb flickered twice and stayed steady. He chalked it up to the wiring. The second odd thing was the coat. Tom kept an old wool overcoat on the newel post at the bottom of the stairs. It was the first thing he reached for in the morning and the last thing he touched at night. One Tuesday evening he came in from work and the coat faced the other way. He stood with his hand on it for longer than necessary, then turned it back. "Not funny," he said, though no one had told a joke. He asked himself later if he had turned it without thinking. He decided he probably had, and let himself believe it. A few days passed. He woke twice in the night, with the sense that someone had just walked through the upstairs hallway. He knew that feeling from barracks, waking as a body went by, a change in air that the brain learned to track. But this house had no corridor wide enough for other men, and no other men. He sat up, listened, heard the ordinary plumbing noises and a far dog, and lay back down. "Draft," he said out loud, and the word felt like a lid set on a pot. Something could still simmer, but it would not boil over. On the evening before Halloween, Tom came home earlier than usual. The foreman had dismissed the crew by dusk. The cold front sat stubborn on the horizon and the rails sang with it. He lit the stove and set a pot on to heat. The radio offered a bright band that did not match the light. He turned it down until the trumpet was a whisper. He ate standing up, then washed the plate and leaned it in the rack. He took his mail in a stack and set it on the table. He would open it later. There would be nothing urgent. As he reached to hang his coat on the newel post, he felt resistance. The coat snagged as though another hand held the sleeve. The snag let go a fraction of a second later. He stood still with the coat in his hand. He heard nothing but his own breath and the tiny tick of cooling metal from the stove. He hung the coat and stepped back. The air on the stairs felt colder than the air in the hall. He went to the kitchen to check the back door. The bolt was set. He checked the front. The chain was snug. He checked the latches on the windows in the living room and the kitchen. He checked the cellar door. It was shut, the hook in place. He told himself it was habit, not fear. He told himself again that he did not scare easy anymore. At 9 o'clock, a group of children came up the walk, voices small and brave. Tom turned on the porch light and waited at the door. He gave them licorice and pennies. One boy, his mask pushed up, peered past Tom into the house and said, "Does your upstairs creak at night?" Tom smiled like men smile at children they do not understand, and said, "Only the way it should." The boy nodded, as if he had expected that answer. When the last costume had gone and the porch was quiet, Tom turned off the light and shut the door. He did not lock it right away. He stood behind it listening. The house felt attentive. He did not know what that meant, except that the space seemed to hold his movements a fraction longer than usual, as if testing their weight. He locked the door. He went to the foot of the stairs and looked up. The new bulb made a circle of decent light on the landing. Beyond it, the hallway ran into shadow. He remembered his Friday habit and wished, briefly, that it were Friday, so that sweeping could simplify the night by giving it a job. Then he climbed to the landing and stood to the side to reach the pull chain. As his fingers grazed it, the chain moved toward him. Only a fraction of an inch, enough to be nonsense. He didn't pull it. He left the light on and went to bed. He woke around 2. No dream. No noise as such. He knew what had roused him. Someone standing still in the hallway, close enough that he could tell the difference between empty air and air occupied. He lay without moving. The house settled once in a sound like a slow exhale. He told himself, "Be practical." He sat up and swung his feet to the floor. The boards were cold. He walked to the door and stood with his hand on the knob. He counted to 8 and opened it. The landing light was still on. The hallway looked the way it always did. Worn runner, wallpaper that had been floral before sun took the color out of it, bedroom doors closed. The coat on the newel post hung the right way. Everything in its place. Tom stepped into the hall and felt the temperature change on his right cheek, like a breath. He turned his head. Nothing there. He reached out with one hand and touched the air. It pushed back just slightly, the way you might brush against a person in a crowded pew. He withdrew his hand. He took a step. The second stair rung differently under his foot. He stood for a long moment, listening to the air. After a while, his body insisted on the ordinary. The need to sit, the need to lie down, the need to finish the night the way nights finish. He went back to bed and consented to sleep. The next morning was the 31st. The day moved with a practical rhythm. Coffee, shaving, the walk to the yard, the steady talk of iron. Between tasks, his mind returned to the landing. He did not tell anyone at work. He wasn't afraid of being laughed at. He was afraid of learning the wrong story by telling it to the wrong mouth. He bought 2 extra bulbs at lunch and put them in his coat pocket like talismans he didn't believe in. He left early. The foreman waved him off with a joke about candy. Tom walked home in a wind that made leaves scrape along the curb like paper getting ready to burn. He unlocked his door and stepped inside, and knew immediately that someone had been on the stairs since morning. The hat he kept on the newel post had been moved an inch forward, the brim now shading the top step. It was a simple change that only a person who lived with the hat would notice. He set it back without comment. He took the 2 new bulbs from his coat and put one on the 3rd stair and one on the kitchen table. He warmed soup, ate half, and left the rest on the stove. He put a strip of flour across the kitchen threshold and across the middle of the landing as if planning to catch a mouse doing something unwise. He sat at the table with the mail and read nothing. He turned the radio down to a murmur that might be mistaken for distance. When the first knock came, he opened the door without looking through the glass and handed out licorice again. Small figures drifted up and away. A paper ghost tugged against its string at someone's porch across the street until it unhooked and sailed toward the telephone wires. The night settled in, the way nights do. A steady pressure, a change in the reach of the lamp on the end table, a tick that didn't matter until it did. Tom cleared the strip of wrappers from the table and put the kettle on for tea he would not drink. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at the landing. The flower line lay flat and bright like verse on a page. He took 2 steps up and then stopped. There was a footfall above him, not a heavy tread, a placing, deliberate. It matched his pause, as if it had expected him to stop there and was pleased that the scene had been properly rehearsed. He said steadily, "All right," as he had said to the burned bulb, and went up. When his toe reached the floor, a mark appeared in it 3 inches to the right of his foot. It wasn't a shoe. It wasn't a bare foot. It was 3 toe-shaped dents that turned slightly inward, like a child learning to stand. He watched the dents deepen and then settle. Someone knocked on the front door. Tom didn't move. The knocking went away. He watched the flower as if it were a clock. The mark did not change. After a time, he reached down and touched the flower. It was soft and ordinary under his fingertip. He wiped it away and crossed the landing and opened the bedroom door. The room was as he had left it. He closed the door and went down the stairs. At the bottom, he looked back. The flower had a new mark in it, an imprecise oval, as if a palm had leaned there and then been taken away. He slept on the couch. He did not dream. He woke before dawn and found the flower unaltered from what he remembered, which did not persuade him of much. He swept it up and put the broom away and made coffee. He looked at the hat on the newel post and left it where it was. He opened the back door and breathed October as if it were medicine. Across the street, Mrs. Klein's husband loaded their truck with crates of apples. He raised a hand. Tom almost asked him to come over, stand on the landing, and say what he felt. He didn't. It would not help to have someone else's name for the same absence. Saturday brought smaller changes. The icebox hummed a beat too slow and recovered. The kettle let off steam with a whistle he hadn't heard it make before. The coat felt colder when he put it on. At noon, he went to the cellar to bring up coal and stood with his hand on the pull string for the bulb longer than he wanted to. He pulled it, and the light came in a sickly wash and steadied. On his way back up, he thought he heard someone step aside at the top to let him pass, like two people meeting on a narrow stair. He didn't look up as he came through the door. He didn't want to test the feeling, and he didn't want to insult it either. In the afternoon, he walked to the grocer for bread and butter and went by the sheriff's office without looking in. Sheriff West had a way of turning questions into debts. Tom didn't need to owe anyone a story. He kept walking. He returned home with the small loaf under his arm and a sensation gathering at the base of his throat, like standing near a blast furnace, the warmth distant and alarming for being so well behaved. The days followed one another with the method that comes after harvest. Cooler mornings, earlier lamps. The guest in the house, he had begun to think of it with that word, did not rattle pots or slam doors. It preferred patience. It stood where people stand when they are waiting to be introduced. It chose thresholds and learned how long it could remain before the house would complain. The house did not complain. By the second week of November, Tom had started a notebook. He did not write anything dramatic in it. He wrote the time he heard a foot on the stairs, which board gave, whether the landing was cold, whether he woke at 2 or at 3. He wrote when the stairwell bulb flickered, and when it did not. He wrote, hat forward, coat left, kettle late, door chain swayed once, radio volume rose a notch, not my doing. Some entries were only a line drawn across the page. On those days, nothing had happened, or too much had happened for specifics. One Sunday, he scrubbed the kitchen floor on his knees the way his mother had, and the guest was quiet while he did it, as if acknowledging labor. Another evening, he came home to find the pantry jars arranged in pairs by height. He laughed in the brief, unconvincing way a man laughs when relieved and confused at once, then put the jars back. An hour later, the pairs returned. He left them in their matched order and slept without trouble that night. He began stepping over the second stair after dark. He did not think this was superstition. It felt like good manners. Leave the place on the step where something stands, and it may leave your places alone. He slept better when he gave the stair its space. He did not tell anyone this. In mid-November, Mrs. Klein stopped him outside the Five and Dime and asked if he was all right. She said he looked tired. He said he was sleeping on the couch to give the bed a rest, and heard the words as he said them, ridiculous and true. She pressed a small paper parcel into his hands and told him it was bread her sister had sent too much of. When he got home and opened it, it was not bread, but a new bulb wrapped in newspaper and a pack of matches. He put the bulb on the third stair and the matches in the kitchen bowl. He said, "Thank you," to no one, and it felt honestly meant. On a Tuesday in late November, a storm rolled in early. The street disappeared. The house took on the sound of a ship. Tom sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open and the radio low. The upstairs door to the spare room drifted an inch and stopped. He went up and shut it and set a chair against it without comment. He came back down and stood at the foot of the stairs and felt a pressure on his chest like the moment before a cough. He put a hand to the newel post and waited for it to pass. It did. When he took his hand away, 4 faint lines showed on the wood, not scratches so much as impressions left by weight. They faded within the hour. He tried a practical experiment. He moved the key from its nail by the stove and put it in his pocket. He left it there for 3 days. During those days, the stairwell bulb did not flicker, and the coat did not turn, and the hat did not move an inch. The air on the landing remained colder than the hallway, but not by much. On the 4th day, he hung the key back on the nail. That night, the chain on the front door swayed once, barely enough to show, and a clean oval appeared in dust on the landing as if a palm had rested there while stepping off the last stair. He wrote, "Key on nail, guest pleased." The first real snow came the week after Thanksgiving. Tom shoveled the walk before dawn and listened to the quiet, the way a man listens to a friend decide what to say. He went in and took his coat off and left boots on the mat. He made coffee and leaned against the counter and said into the kitchen, "All right, we can share the stairs." He wasn't sure if he had meant to say it aloud. He felt foolish, then relieved, then steady. The arrangement held. The guest kept to the landing and the second stair after dark. It did not come into the bedroom when he was in it. It did not cross the kitchen threshold while he ate. It stood in the narrow place between rooms, and in return Tom used the rooms as rooms, and did not walk into the narrow place more than he had to. When the radio lied about the weather or the price of grain, the wall behind it gave 3 quiet taps that sounded like a cough politely correcting a story. He tapped the table in answer and felt crazy for doing it, and calm after he had. On the last night of the year, Tom went to the Kleins for a small party with coffee and a lemon cake that tasted as if it had waited too long for summer. He came home at 11 and locked the door and set the chain and stood by the stairs to listen. The house sounded like a body at rest. He went up to bed. At midnight, the town blew 3 horns and 2 men fired a rifle, once each, in the field behind the school. In the pause after, the stairwell bulb glowed briefly without his hand on the chain and then let itself darken. He said, "Happy New Year," and laughed at himself and slept through until morning. In January, the rail yard cut hours. Tom took odd jobs, shoveling a path for the church steps, hauling crates for the grocer, fixing a loose hinge at the school. He liked the work because it was work, and because it kept him out of the house in the worst light of the day, just after noon, when winter refuses to make up its mind. At night, he read more. He wrote his sister. He got up once at 2 because he heard a foot on the stair and went to the landing and said, "I know," and went back to bed. By February, he had stopped placing flour. He had stopped moving the jars. He had stopped testing. You do not test your own shadow. The guest remained. It was not his friend, not his enemy, not his invention. It was someone who had been in the house longer than he had and would remain when he left. He knew this without resentment. Some houses come with wells. Some come with someone who stands very still on the stairs when the night is thin. Years later, because there were years, Tom kept the key on its nail and the spare bulbs under the sink. He married once, and it did not last. He retired, and it did. He came to know the sounds of winter and the noises old wood makes when it wants to remind you that it is honest. The guest did not change. When the radio finally broke and the television came in its place, the wall learned a new way to tap and did not use it much. When Tom's sister visited from Ohio, she slept downstairs. "I'm not much for stairs," she said, and he did not argue. When neighbors came by after the blizzard of '54, they stood at the foot of the stairs without realizing and raised their voices a little as if they were trying not to be rude in a library. Tom never learned the guest's name. He sometimes imagined it was the house itself, standing where it had learned to balance. He sometimes thought a soldier had come home in pieces to the wrong address and decided to be polite about it. On certain nights, he believed nothing at all, and the steps made their small complaints, and the landing kept its temper, and that was enough. He died in summer, with the windows open and the curtains lifting as if they were trying to get a better look at the street. The house took new owners that fall, a young couple with a child who liked to sit on the second stair and drop a rubber ball to watch it bounce. The couple learned the same routines without being told. Leave the key on the nail, step wide on the second stair, change the bulb on the first weekend of the month. They set a crib in the bedroom, and when the baby would not sleep, they walked the hall and sang old songs and paused at the landing without noticing that they always paused in the same place. If you go to the end of Ash Street now, the porch is new and the paint is newer. The hat and coat are gone, and the old axe has rusted and been thrown away. On late October nights, if you stand on the sidewalk and listen very carefully, the stairwell light will turn on without a hand, and a quiet will gather on the landing that feels like a person making room for you to pass. The house has learned the rhythm of other lives. It still remembers Tom's. It keeps the key on the nail. It minds the door chain. It stands very still where the stairs make a choice and waits for polite company to go first. The story doesn't need more than that. A house, a man, a habit, someone on the stairs when no one ought to be. The rest is living with it, and living with it is what people did in 1947 and do now. Step around the second stair. Say goodnight to an empty landing. Sleep on the couch once in a while. And if the chain on the door sways once, barely enough to show, say, "All right."